I'm just thinking if he
You can be
isn't looking
oversight.
directly
That's
at
where he's looking is fine right now.
it is good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Got my good side.
Okay, well, take turns, so you can do whatever you want to do.
Oh, okay. Do we begin at this point?
You can speak, do nothing,
Oh,
Sing
make
a song.
faces.
all right. Well, this is a very interesting experiment um, to go back and reflect on some 55 years of life. I say that because the first 10 years of my life are very hazy. I can only remember some incidents now and then, but by and large, if I think back, life for me pretty much began when I was in my early teens. Um, it began, as my recollection, with a summer spent in Chicago. Went up from Mississippi and ran an elevator all summer. That was my 14th birthday. Was running an elevator 8 hours a day and living with a pastor, friend of Dad's, in Chicago. Got into trouble there, as I often did. Stayed out late one night, and when I got home, the front door was locked. And I tried to crawl in a back window, got stuck in the window, knocked down some plants, and essentially was put under house arrest. My comings and goings were severely curtailed for that little episode, but it was an interesting summer, and running an elevator uh, is kind of a boring way to make a living, but at least I made a little bit of money. The early life was filled with moves. We always seemed to be moving and going from one school to another. My recollection is that I'd gone to 15 schools by the time I graduated from high school. And the result was that I didn't learn to play any sports, for which my children, in a sense, suffered. The life consisted of learning how to play chess and checkers and collect stamps and do things that I could either do by myself or with one other person, because it takes a time to uh, get friends. And I guess I've only got one friend from my prior to my 15th year. That was Bill Vigris, lived behind us on Grace Avenue. And we used to pal around together. But I think that the kind of life that we lived, which was a life of moving, was a life which um, kind of raises you not only to be independent, but as a person kind of living by yourself. Um, the summer that I was 15 was a summer I spent at Circle Pines. Learned to drive that summer, driving the truck around. They hired me. Didn't pay me very much, but I liked the camp and I liked the people. And I think that the experience of learning to drive that truck out across the fields was something that was exhilarating. That was maybe the beginning of my love for the automobile. The summer that I was 16, a friend mentioned that they were too many Oz. What? You're making noises.
Restart. I hit the camera and I jiggled the camera.
Oh.
You don't have to restart the whole thing, just the last thought.
Oh.
Cut this
Okay.
out. But let me change focus.
A friend mentioned, right?
A friend mentioned that they were taking cattle to Europe, and wouldn't it be neat to participate in this program? And it sounded like a good idea to me. So I hitchhiked out to Virginia and signed up. And the first trip was we went to Poland. We took a load of horses to Poland, and spent a week in Danzig, and then up to Iceland, picked up a load of Icelandic ponies, and back down to Poland again. We were told that they were going to be sent down to Czechoslovakia to be used in the mines because, as you might guess, during the war, most of the animals were killed. There were lots of people killed, but there were lots of animals killed too. So Europe was desperately in need of cows and horses and beasts of burden. That was such a successful trip that I signed on a second trip, and that time went to Bremen. Oh, by the way, I met this friend, Dan Dungan, in Poland. His ship came in, and I met him on a pier. I think we were just on the way going out. He was just coming in, and so I saw him for 10 or 15 minutes. So we actually didn't sail together, but we did see each other in Poland. This was kind of the beginning of a life which didn't really apply itself to getting ahead with school. I've often said that I started college at 16 and graduated when I was 31. And that came about because the school that I was left in was a combination high school and college. It turned out that that when we lived in Mississippi, the high school there was not very much of a challenge for me, and they let me kind of go at my own pace. And after school in the afternoon, I would go up to the college, and they let me take courses there for which I got high school credit. So I took German and French at the college, and I took the regular subjects at the high school. And so at the end of 2.5 years, I had enough credits to graduate from high school. And at that point, Dad and Mom were leaving for Liberia, and parked me in a school in eastern Tennessee where, as I mentioned, it had 2 years of high school and 2 years of college. So by the time I graduated from high school, I already had my first 2 years of college done. The opportunities for doing things that were interesting kind of interfered with progress. After I got back from the cattle boat experiences, I was now into 1947, and I went back to school for some 6 or 7 months, and the next thing that happened was that I got a letter from Dad saying that they were looking for somebody on a mission station that was back in the interior. How would I like to come to Africa? It was, I remember sitting in the Foster Street house and trying to decide what to do, whether I should go on to college, whether I should go to Africa, or whether I should go into the service. And my brother Frank came waltzing through the front door, and I said, "Hey, Frank, you know, I need some advice. What should I do?" And I gave him the dilemma. And his off-the-cuff remark was, "When you're 40, what are you going to wish you'd done?" Well, I said, "That's easy. I'm going to wish I'd gone to Africa." He said, "See how easy that was?" So 2 weeks later, I had my bags packed and was heading for Newport News, where I was to pick up a ship that was going to take me to West Africa. It was a freighter, a French freighter. And number one, the ship was late. So I sat in a YMCA room in Newport News waiting daily for this ship to arrive while my money ran out. And all I had was a ticket to get on the ship. And luckily it arrived, but by the time it got there I had $30 left. And being, I guess I was just before I was 18, I thought, well, things are going to work out. So I got on the ship and we sailed 21 days to landed in Dakar in West Africa. The first thing I did when I got there was squander half my money on a pair of short pants and a sun helmet. which cut me down to $15. And we were due to go on down the coast, and so we did. There was a family on the ship, a black family with 7 children, that was going out as faith missionaries. That meant that they really had no backing other than whatever they could get people to give them. And on the ship, we were the only passenger. No, sorry, there was this family of 9, 7 children, the mother and father. There was a missionary couple from the Congo that was heading back, and myself. So there were 12 of us. Now, the officers of the ship allowed this couple from the Congo who were white and myself to eat with the officers. This large family, this large black family, after the crew ate, they set up a table and the 9 of them ate together. The father felt that this was discrimination and raised such a ruckus that the captain had him put in a cell. And so he was a prisoner for the rest of the voyage. And when we reached Conakry, they let him and his family off, and that was the end of the affair in terms of any kind of penalties. But as far as I was concerned, now I was in French West Africa, and I was trying to get to Liberia. And the only way that you could get down there was to find a ship or a plane, because my ticket ended in Conakry, and I was some 600 miles from Liberia, and I had $15. So I thought, well, I'll wire Mom and Dad and have them send me some money. So I walked into a telegraph office. This was a French colony, and said, "Parlez-vous français?" And the guy said, "Oui." And I couldn't think of what to say next, so I was embarrassed, so I turned around and walked out. So I still didn't have any ticket, no money. And so I went back down to the ship and was talking to the couple who was going down to the Congo. And they offered to lend me enough money to buy a plane ticket to Liberia. And I should send it back to them when I got to Liberia. So I went down and I bought a plane ticket, but the plane didn't go for 2 days. And I had no place to stay. So I took my suitcase and I was sitting in a park. It was a nice warm evening. This is in the tropics. And I was sitting in the park when one of the children from this black family came walking by and saw me sitting there. "Well, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm waiting for my plane, which is going in 2 days. And I have no place to go, and I didn't have any money for a room." "Well, why don't you come home with us? We'll give you a place to stay." And they were staying with some missionary family. So I said, great. And they were staying, I remember, in a very large building. Second floor had a big veranda that ran all the way around. And they gave me some blankets, and I slept on the floor on the veranda for 2 days. For 2 nights. And on Wednesday, that was a Monday, on Wednesday, went out to the airfield. I had a raincoat that was one of these classy looking raincoats, but in the tropics it rains. And this raincoat was kind of like a sponge. And by the time the plane got there, there was no terminal. It was just a kind of a thatched roof place where you stood and waited for the plane to come in. And I was soaking to the skin, had a terrible headache, and got aboard the plane and headed for Liberia. Well, the flight wasn't very long. I think it was maybe an hour, hour and a half. I landed at about 8 o'clock at night at Roberts Field. And again, I was probably 80 miles from where Mom and Dad lived, and they didn't know when I was coming in because I hadn't been able to communicate with them since my French wasn't very good. And So now I was at the airport. And how do you get to Monrovia? Well, native trucks in Liberia only travel when they're full. And if you book passage on one, you might get to the next town, and if somebody gets off or they unload, they sit and wait. You might be there a day or might be there a week. And so I got to talking to a foreign guy and told him my dilemma. I needed to get to Monrovia. He said, well, what you ought to do is talk to somebody that's come up to meet a plane and see if you can bum a ride back. And I said, well, I was kind of embarrassed. Did he know anybody? And he said, yeah. And so he went over and talked to a couple, and they agreed to take me back to Liberia, to Monrovia. So about 11:30 at night, I arrived at the College of West Africa. Now, the College of West Africa has a wall around it and a locked front door. And trying to get to mom and dad was, again, pretty difficult. So I stood out in the street and I yelled and I hollered and I made enough noise that finally Dad came to the window to see what the problem was, spotted me, and came down and let me in. The next 2 years I lived mainly up in Ganta, which was right on the border of French West Africa. And it was a kind of a interesting station. One thought comes to my mind right now. The doctor who was the doctor when I was born was a Dr. Hyla Waters. And after China closed, she came back to the United States and went to Liberia. And she finished up her missionary term on the same mission station, Ganta, which is the station that where I lived. And 2 books were written about her. One was her life in China, and the other book was her life in Liberia. And the one in Liberia I found particularly interesting because she arrived there about 3 months after I left, and the book is filled with photographs of the mission station that I was on. Life on the mission station was kind of complicated by one of the missionaries who ran the station. His name was Dr. Harley, and when I first got there I lived with the Harleys. I lived in their house, and Dr. Harley had had a bad experience back in the 20s. He had been on this mission station almost 50 years, but back in the 20s he had returned from furlough and had not unpacked all of his boxes when he got back, as was his custom. And one of his children, a son, had eaten a plant that was poisonous, and Dr. Harley could not find his pulmotor, his stomach pump in time, and the kid died. As a result, Dr. Harley really suffered irreparable emotional trauma. He disappeared into the bush, I'm told. This was long before I was there. This was in the late 20s. And was gone for a couple of weeks. And when he came back, he never again worked as a medical doctor. His wife was a nurse, and she ran the hospital, and she would come back and ask him questions, but he never actually practiced medicine again. This made it kind of difficult because he was there as a medical doctor, medical missionary, but he began to work more and more for the Liberian government, building roads. He taught people how to put windows in their houses. The people there lived in round mud huts with thatched roofs. And so in his own way, he did quite a bit to improve the lot of the local people. It was a Mono tribe. But he also pretty well became an agnostic, perhaps even tending toward becoming an atheist, which is kind of difficult since he was running the mission station. And when we had an evangelist sent out to work at the station, a guy by the name of Charles Britt, he and Britt didn't get along at all. Britt always was trying to get some transportation to go out and preach, and there was never any available for him. So we had a lot of kind of ruckuses over that issue. Now, life in Liberia on a mission station is not like the United States. When we would get a convert to Christianity, you got the convert for life. That person no longer was a member of their village unless they happened to have a very enlightened chief of the village. And so the result was that the decision to become a Christian meant a real 7-day-a-week life change for any convert. This meant that the church had to build industrial, we had schools that taught people how to make a living, because in a village, the village were very communal. If you lived in a village, your role as a man or as a woman was very well fixed. The rice, which is a staple diet, was planted around the periphery of the village, and the women planted it, and the men cut it, the rice. And but if you did not participate in the ritual of what they called the bush school, you could not grow up to be a ruling elder of the village. And so we got a lot of children who simply left their villages and lived on the mission station. The other thing is the Liberian government required all mission stations to have schools. There was no public education, so the only education was provided by the mission schools. And so when Britt came out, I moved in with he and his new wife. I lived with them for the balance of my term there. One very fortunate experience I had, a professional team was sent out to make a movie for the Methodist Church and the Lutheran Church. And since I was not a regular missionary, I was given the job of driving them around the country and helping them make the films. And they paid me an extra $30 a month. The deal was that I was going to get my transportation over and my food while I was there. The fact that I helped this photography team meant that I got $30 a month for several months, and that money was used to come back home through Europe. On January 1st, 1950, Dad and I sailed from Monrovia up to Conakry, where we were going to pick up a ship for France. Mother had come home earlier the previous year, and so Dad and I were going to come back through Europe, and Dad was going to look around for perhaps a job in Europe. Liberia had been very hard on him. The tropics are exceedingly tough. Rain 3 months, then dry season, and so forth. We got up to, it's an interesting story, we got up to Conakry, and it was a Sunday. We landed there Sunday afternoon, and 2 o'clock we got off the ship, and there was a ship ready to sail to France at 5 o'clock. But we had to buy the ticket with French francs, and we had American dollars, and no banks were open. There was a Danish guy at the pier who came down whenever ships came in to see who was on them. And Dad sat down in his suitcase and put his head in his hands because the next ship was 4 days later. If we missed that ship at 5 o'clock. And this Danish guy said to me, there's one guy in town who has the money. He's a French storekeeper, and he would have money in his safe. And if he'll change the money for you, you can catch the ship. So I got in his Jeep, and we went tearing off. We had to first get our passports stamped, and then we went to this French merchant's house and knocked on the door and told him what we wanted. And he said, sure. He said, I'll change your money for you. And then he said to me, you don't remember me, do you? And I said, no, I don't. He said, I was down in Liberia a year ago, and you gave me a ride into town from the harbor. And I had to do something, and then took me back out. And in Monrovia, that was probably 1.5 miles or 2 miles. So instead of having to walk, I'd given him a ride. Well, I hadn't remembered it, but it was something, the kind of thing you do, just like this Danish guy was helping me. And so here was a guy that I'd helped, and he was now able to help me. Well, at 4:45, we got back to the pier and got our tickets, and 15 minutes later, we were on the gangplank and up into our cabins, and we sailed that Sunday evening. We arrived in France, and boy, that father of mine, what he would do is he would always write ahead wherever we were going to, some church or whatever it was. And I remember we got down to Switzerland, and he had written to this convent. It was they had a nursing facility or something, and I was so embarrassed because the room that they gave us to sleep in, you had to go through doors that said women only, men forbidden. And so we went down this hall, and then when we went in to eat, there were some 160 women and the two of us. And you can imagine, for a 20-year-old, this was very embarrassing. And of course, Dad, here I was 20, feeling like I was close to being an adult. And of course, he always had to carry the passports, and he had to carry the tickets so they didn't get lost. And it really bugged me. I remember being in Paris and feeling like I ought to be carrying my own tickets, but he was adamant. There was no way that he was going to trust this 20-year-old with his own tickets or his own passport. Well, we got up to England, and he had us booked in with a mid-mission group. And this mid-mission group, they kind of drove me crazy because they had services every night. And we would go down into this chapel, and we'd do dumb stuff like they'd sing a song, maybe 5 verses, and you'd get all done singing, and then somebody would stand up and say, let's sing it again, and really with vigor, and you'd go through another 5 verses. Well, after 3 or 4 days, I said to Dad, this is ridiculous. Here we are in England. We can't do anything. We can't go anyplace. We got to go to church services all the time. And so he finally agreed, and we moved down to a hotel, and were then able to visit some of the museums and so forth. We got back in the summer of 1950, and I went off to school at Antioch College. I only went there for 6 months, and it was a co-op school. So the first 3 months I was in school, and the second 3 months I was in Chicago working for UL as a test technician. And during that summer, the Korean War broke out, June of 1950. And by the end of that year, I got to thinking, since this was a United Nations action and I believed in the United Nations, that this was probably if there was any war that I could serve in, it would be this kind of an action. So by December, instead of going back to school, I moved in with Aunt Helen and Uncle Carl Beale and waited to be called. But things kind of drug a little bit. I had gone down and applied to get into the Navy, Air Force, because I thought it would be neat to fly off carriers. And well, first I was going to be a Marine. As I was a kid, I read a lot of P.C. Wren, and I decided I was going to be in the French Foreign Legion when I grew up. But by the time I grew up, the allure of the French Foreign Legion had kind of died. But I thought it would really be great to be in the Marine Corps. And I can remember going downtown in Chicago, and they were running a movie called The Sands of Iwo Jima. And so I stopped to see it, and someplace in that movie they pointed out that in times of war, the Marine Corps has 90% casualties or something like that. And I thought, well, those odds aren't really great odds, that maybe I should pick something a little different. So, well, maybe the Navy is a good compromise, and I'll get in the Navy Air Force, and I'll fly off of carriers, because I'd always kind of wanted to learn how to fly. But it turned out that the Naval Air Cadet program was closed. They had too many volunteers, and I'd been living with the Beals for some 2 months, and so I thought, well, I'll go in the Air Force, and if the thing opens up, then I'll switch to the Navy. So I went off to in the Air Force on 5th of February 1951, and I can remember walking down to the train station. There were about 20 of us that were being marched down to the train station, and some drunk guy fell in at the back of the line and was calling cadence as we walked down to the train station. And we got on a train. I thought, that's pretty neat, because we were going to Texas. We were going from Chicago to Texas, and it was cold in Chicago. And I thought, this is not a bad deal. But when I landed in Texas and got my first experience with the Air Force, I decided that we really weren't meant for each other. I didn't really like the attitude of the guys that met us when we got off the train. And because the war was on, boot camp or basic training was cut way back. We were in San Antonio for a couple of weeks, and then we were sent up to Wichita Falls. They say in Wichita Falls that you can march in mud up to your knees with dust blowing in your face, and I can attest to that. Oklahoma would blow in every afternoon and blow out every night. And we lived in tents with mud everywhere. But from there, things got a little better. They sent me up to Denver, where I learned, I had volunteered. When I went in, I wanted to be a heavy equipment operator, a radio repairman, but they put me in personnel. So I wound up in the orderly room. I went up and took my classes, and then they sent me down to Mississippi to an air training command base. And I kept trying to get overseas. Every time they'd have a overseas shipment, I would volunteer, put my name on it. And meanwhile, Dad and Mom had gone to Austria, and so it happened that an assignment came down to go to France. They needed a guy with my training, and so I was sent up to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. That was the summer of 1951, and as luck would have it, I was set to sail. I'd been called to, been posted to a ship, and what they had there was a practice, was a money-making practice. The cooks would ask for a certain number of people to pull KP. That meant peeling potatoes and working in the kitchen. So what they would do is maybe ask for 60 guys, and then they would come around and say to you, say, I know you're sailing, if you'd like to give me $10 or $20, I can get a substitute for you. And so a lot of guys were paying to get off. Well, what they would do is not get any replacements. They only needed 30. They'd ask for 60. They were making $600,000 a day that they were splitting among the cooks. And somebody turned them in. And so an air inspector came around and said, anybody that saw cooks take money, speak up. So I said I'd seen it. Well, I was pulled off the ship and put in a barracks to await the trial of these cooks. And so the next 3 months, I sat in Kent Gilmer, New Jersey, waiting for this trial to come up. And finally, I went to inquire as to when the trial was going to come up, and it turned out they transferred all the cooks. And since we were classed as transients, nobody cared. We could have sat there for the next 3 years waiting for the trial, and nobody would have cared. So as soon as we found out that what had happened, they put us on the next ship, and I headed for Europe. When I landed in Europe, everybody on the ship was headed for France, and I went into the personnel guy and I said, say, my parents are in Austria. Is there any chance that I could get stationed down in Austria? And he said, well, they don't need anybody with your skill level, but I could ship you down there at a lower skill level. I said, well, I'll take that. That's great. So he did. So everybody went to France except me, and I climbed on a train and headed for Vienna. And I got down to Vienna, and I was stationed on a base that was 15 miles out of Vienna. And it was pretty neat. It had been built by the German Air Force as a pilot training base. So we had suites of rooms, nice hardwood floors. There were 180 of us on the base. And the base was maintained as a port of entrance for Pan Am to land. We were out in the Russian zone. Vienna, like Berlin, was surrounded by the Russian zone. And so this base was, we had one road that we could take into town, or a railroad. You could drive on one road or a railroad. And we were about 90 miles back inside the Russian lines. Well, since my parents lived in Vienna, I lived at home. And I would go to work every day. They had a bus that ran into Vienna, and I would get up and catch the bus out to the base and work and then come back in. And so I lived for some 3 years with Mom and Dad at this church in Vienna. 6 months before I was to return to the United States, I got married, and I'd gone with a duffel bag and came back, as I remember, with some 3 tons of stuff heading for Hinsdale to the Davison house. Huge box. It was my gosh, that box was big enough to put a car in, as well as I remember, that landed in the Davison driveway. And we lived, Roy and Erica and I lived with the Davisons from February of '55 until September. Oh, one incident on the ship coming back. The women were put together. So Erica was housed with several other women, and I was in a cabin with, well, it was a fairly large room with 5 other guys. And one morning, about 5 o'clock, the ship was pitching, kind of like running over railroad ties. You'd go up over a wave and whap, you'd come down. And suddenly somebody knocked on the door and said, some guy's wife is down in the um, um, dining room with a life preserver on saying the ship's going to sink. And I said, well, yeah, but that's my wife. And I went down, sure enough, there was Erica with her life jacket on, convinced that the ship was going to sink, because when it goes over a wave, the propellers come out of the water, and so the whole ship kind of shudders, and so you crash down, and then you go up over the next wave, and you crash down. And oh, by the way, I think she was sick the whole 9 days that we came back. In fact, there were a whole group of wives that every morning they would get up and get dressed. They'd go up and sit on the hoses. There were hoses wound on the bulkhead, and they would sit and stare at the ocean all day, and then they would go down and get in their bunks and sleep. But back to Hinsdale. We lived in Hinsdale. I got a job in a hardware store and worked until fall. I had signed up at Northwestern to start in the fall, and this time I was serious. I was going to go back to, I was 25 now. I was going to go back to school and finish getting my degree. What?
I think we're getting to a point where maybe we could stop and go and eat.
Good. Excellent idea.
He's about as romantic about getting married as your dad.
This is all going
Oh,
on tape. If
well,
you
we're
just
gonna
stop
cut it
and-
off. We're gonna cut it off. You certainly are just smoothing over everything, Ed. Where did you meet her? I didn't mean to be telling you to talk about Ed. I was just putting in my own feeling that I'd like to hear more about you and your beliefs and your reasons for why you did what you did,
All right.
if you want to share them.
Talk to each other. I want to hear you.
Okay. I think what I'll do is do a little bit of that before I go on then to the next phase of life. And kind of talk about what was happening to me.
You're on camera. You're on.
Oh, okay.
That's it.
At this point in the story, 25 years
Wait,
old.
wait, wait, wait. Pause and then start over again, because you talk right over yourself and it'll be hard to cut it in.
Okay. At this point in the...
Stop and count to 3 and then say that.
All right. At this point in the story, I am 25 years old. And this is probably a good time to reflect a little bit on some of the whys. I've been talking about what I did, but not very much about what I was thinking and what my interests were. I mentioned that as a kid, I had had to develop skills which were very individualistic. A few playmates, constantly moving, and my response to a life like that was that I kind of thrived on it. I loved to visit new places. I loved to travel. I read a lot. I went through books. I guess from the time I was 8 or 9, I was going through books at the rate of probably 4 or 5 a week. And they were books that got tougher and tougher. By that I meant when I was 8, I was reading detective stuff and mystery stories. By the time I was 11, I was reading The Robe and The Big Fisherman and books of that type. So life was, in a sense, becoming more serious. I had, by the time I was 12, I had pretty much left fiction behind. Was reading adventure stories, historical drama, and was becoming a person who, while I had interest in technical subjects, was really moving in the direction of philosophy and history, although I guess I didn't realize it. Um, in my early days, with the other members of the family, I went to church and Sunday school, but once I could make the decisions for myself, um, I kind of quit going. And I think Dad remarked once that, told me later that at 16 I had told him that he might find it necessary to have a God in his life, but I certainly didn't. And so the adventures, I guess, or the reasons for some of the things that I did, such as the Africa trip, was more for the adventure and the opportunity to see how different people lived than it was out of any particular religious beliefs or religious persuasions. Uh, the At 18, the thought of going to Africa was pretty exciting. I didn't know anybody that had been there. It seemed like an interesting thing to do, just as the cattle boats. It was partly humanitarian. I think that many of the books that I read were humanitarian oriented, but during World War II, I certainly had bought war stamps and was much more like most of the other kids around. It was as the years began to go by, and I got more involved in history and trying to understand the causes of things, that that I began to look for more meaning in life. For instance, in high school, one of the papers I wrote was on the Franco-Prussian War, the causes of the Franco-Prussian War. While other students were writing on much more mundane subjects. So I was a pretty serious kind of a kid, and very much concerned with the healthcare problems in the United States. I believed in, by the time I was 16, I certainly believed in socialized medicine. I was very concerned about the programs, welfare programs, and so forth for the poor and the indigent. So I guess I was a humanist, but again, didn't realize it at the time. It wasn't until later when I took philosophy that I began to apply names to some of the positions that I was taking or holding. When I went to Africa, I did attend the church services, but not particularly because of any religious desires, but it was just something. It was part of the territory. You were expected to do it, so I did it. So it was, in a sense, part of the price of being on with a mission group. Didn't bother me particularly. It's just something I probably wouldn't have done if I hadn't had the occasion. I did come to some pretty strong beliefs about missionary enterprises, however. One thing that I did was build some playground equipment for at the mission station where I was, at the Ganta station. And it gave me a great deal of pleasure to see old people come in and swing on the swings and slide down the sliding board. And these are people that are animists. They believe that there are spirits in rocks and trees, and they live in constant fear. They're afraid of particular trees, and this kind of fear is something that Christianity does displace. So I think that the Christian witness is something that has brought a lot of relief from superstition. Some people, of course, point to the superstitions that are in Christianity, but when you see people that live in constant fear of their surroundings, uh, it's something that gives you a great deal of gratification when they can break loose from those bonds and are freed of many of those fears. By the time I got ready to go into the service, as I indicated, I was much more, by this time, a world federalist. I believed in the United Nations with a world court. I believed that we should have a standing United Nations Army. I believed that we should uh, give up part of the of sovereignty so that we could, in fact, have a world of peace and justice rather than the traditional historical way of the strong powers kind of doing what they wanted to the weaker powers. And so by the time I got out of the service, I was pretty ripe for going back to church and resuming a more traditional religious life. And so now we're up to 1955. Dad and Mom had a house in Evanston, and it had been taken care of by a family by the name of Heasley, who managed it. There were several apartments that were rented, and it turned out that I was able to get into Northwestern University in September, and at the same time take over the operation of the house. In so doing, I was responsible for collecting the rents and making repairs and so forth. When we first moved in, we shared an apartment on the second floor. We had a front room, and there were three of us, Erica and Roy and I. And within a few months, we had moved down to the first floor, and that's the place we lived then and for the next 6 years. School was kind of hard for me. Those times were kind of hard. I had my GI Bill, which gave us some income. Beside that, I worked at the post office at night. So while I was in school, my daily activities ran getting up about 6:30, off to school at 7:30, home at 5, post office at 6, work till 11, come home and do my studying. And then on the alternate 3 months, I worked for Bell and Howell in Lincolnwood as a co-op student and made enough money so that we were able to survive. And of course, we had the free rent from the house. And so the result was, by the time I graduated from college, I wasn't in debt like many people were. But they were days when we ate a lot of bologna and had very little cash upon which to live. We attended church. We attended a Methodist church at that time. I was active in the church organization, usually on a social concerns commission. And we were in activities at the church such as bowling league, and kids went to Sunday school, etc., and so forth. As I indicated, the years were kind of not only difficult, very little opportunity to do very much. The vacations usually were Colorado to visit mom and dad who had settled in Colorado Springs, but there really weren't any other vacations. There was simply work, and in fact, they let me work on all holidays, vacation days, even while I was in school, so I could go down to the plant and work. Graduated in 1961 and went to work for Bell and Howell, making cameras and projectors, and we had the company acquired a little company in California, and I saw an ad go up on the bulletin board that said that they bought this company, so I immediately went in and asked about getting a transfer to California, and lo and behold, they agreed, and so we moved to California in April of 1961. Of course, at that time, I had two sisters, Alice and Ruth, that both lived in California. Frank was living in Wisconsin, and Helen in Ohio. So there were people that we knew. We settled in Glendora, and I worked in Pasadena, and by that time we had there were 7 of us. So when we went out, there was a car full. And more family get-togethers. We got down to Costa Mesa for family get-togethers, and so there were an increasing number of nieces, nephews, and more or a larger family. During those years, I was at the Methodist Church, again on the Social Concerns Commission, getting, I guess, more frustrated with the church all the time. Felt like I was constantly battling many of the other church members. When it came to social concerns, it seemed like whoever was on the Social Concerns Commission was always trying to convince people to do what I would expect they'd be doing anyway. And so the church activities, of course the potlucks were fun and stuff like that, but in terms of my religious beliefs, I was teaching Sunday school. I was always involved in some of the church activities or church functions, but continued to have questions that ate at me more and more. The next real phase in my life was the separation from Erica, which took place in the late 60s. It was at first kind of manageable because 2 of the kids were living with me and 2 of the kids were living with Erica, but that changed when a company, DuPont, on the East Coast bought the company I was working for and moved me back to the East Coast. It forced me to sell the house and take a couple of the kids with me, tore the family apart, and really, I guess I was really angry that any company could do that to me. Of course, they gave me the choice of quitting, but it wasn't a very viable choice at the time, and so the transfer took place. From their point of view, it was a good deal, and I guess financially it was a good deal for me, but it was very difficult in terms of the kids because there's a almost 3,000 mile geographical distance difference between where I settled and where the kids were living, where some of the kids were living. So I think that move had a real effect in my life. I determined at that point that no company would ever be able to do that to me again, and set out to get to the point so the next time somebody they tried to do it, I would be able to say no, and looked forward to when I could move back to California. The years in Delaware were interesting, but they were simply work. Life consisted of getting up and going and working all day and coming home, and of course, being single, was in a singles group, president of a singles group for a couple of years, so there was that type of activity, but not a whole lot of chance to go away, do anything other than company travel. Company travel was nice. I always tried to tie, when I'd go to Europe, I'd try to spend a few extra days and take advantage of the fact that I got there, so that my love of traveling continued with me. I traveled whenever I got a chance. And in later years, chances came more often. Joined the Presbyterian Church, and once again, same kind of problem. Social Concerns Commission, I always felt like I was fighting with the rest of the board. And I finally decided that perhaps it was time for me to move toward being a Unitarian, and give up the type of church that I'd been attending for years and years and years. When I graduated from college as an engineer, one of the things that troubled me was that I hadn't had the opportunity to take a lot of classes that I wanted to take. I managed a few. Northwestern was a university that was a kind of a long, thin school, and from the Technological Institute, if you wanted to take any kind of a course in the liberal arts department, you had to run down to get to your class, because you only had 10 minutes between classes. And so I managed to sneak in some classes in comparative religions and classes like that, but it was really very difficult to manage very many liberal arts courses other than the ones they taught to the tech students, and I didn't find those very interesting, because I didn't find the tech students very interesting. I much more enjoyed the courses down in the liberal arts department. So one of the things that I did after I got out of school was to go enjoy the junior college system after we moved to California, and began to take classes, sociology and European history and Chinese history and anthropology and so forth, and all the courses that I wanted to take while I was in college and wasn't able to. And an interesting thing began to happen. My technological books began to disappear off the shelves, to be replaced with philosophy books and sociology books and anthropology books. And I realized that I really wasn't a very good engineer. I was much more interested in philosophy and history than I was in engineering. But on the other hand, engineering was a good way to make a living, and so I went on being an engineer, working as an engineer, and spending my free time reading the kind of books that I enjoyed. And so I basically quit reading fiction, and my shelves were filled with books on history and philosophy, especially philosophy. As I said, when I went to Delaware, I decided that I was going to quit the corporate life as soon as I was able to. And I set 1980, when I'd be 50, as the time that that was going to happen, which was 4 years. I figured I could stand it there for 4 years. In the meantime, I got an old house. One of the things I'd always want to do was build a house with my own hands. And I had met Isabel, who is my wife, my present wife, and we bought this old rundown house and decided that we could fix up this house, but by fixing it up, maybe we could get some of the kids involved in it, her children, some of my children, and we'd kind of do it as a project. And a project it was. 7 years we worked on that house. It turned out we had to do everything from the basement up. So while we didn't build a house from scratch, we certainly built a house that took weekends and holidays, and it just, for 7 years, we just kept working at the house. When we got done, we had transformed something that was falling apart into a respectable looking house, and in fact we were able to sell it for enough money to buy a house back in California. The years, however, my 1980 goal didn't pan out. In fact, it wasn't until 1986 that I finally retired. It seemed for a moment that I was going to retire in '85. There was a offer for early retirement in January of '85, and I signed up for it. And a friend of mine in Texas offered to hire me to be the manufacturing manager of a printed circuit board company. So on Easter of 1985, Isabel and I flew to Austin and looked around for a house that we were going to move down to, and I was going to get this job. Well, within a month of our visit down there, before we'd selected a house, two partners had a falling out, and the guy that I knew left the company, and I decided not to go down there. So they, in a sense, rehired me back at DuPont, and I went on working until November, at which point I had to be off the rolls. But they didn't want to let me go. And so Isabel and I formed a corporation which was going to do consulting and instrument development. Isabel was the secretary-treasurer and I was the president. And so on November 30th, I retired. On December 1st, went back to work as a consultant on instrument development for the company there in Delaware. And that went on then until '86, late in '86, at which point we rented a truck, and a 22-foot truck, and loaded everything in that we could get in, and what we couldn't get in we gave away, and we set out for California. Now, in these years, the family, the kids, of course, continued to be very much in our lives. Cheryl, who had stayed with Erica, came to Delaware to live with me, and Frank, who had come to Delaware, had gone back to California. Roy had moved to Delaware and kind of settled down. Rose had come to Delaware for a while, and she had gone back to California, so there was a constant movement back and forth across the country. And so I was able to see Chuck came one summer and worked at the DuPont plant, lived with us. So there was a considerable amount of family interaction. Furthermore, there were many opportunities to get to California in business, since there's a great deal of industry in California that matches the kind of work we were doing. So there were ample opportunities to get out here at company expense and see the family members that were on the West Coast. So also gave me opportunities to keep up with brothers and sisters, as well as the children. The kind of the next phase of life, which was the post-retirement, was a very kind of an awakening. The first thing that happened after we moved to California, I didn't really know what to do with myself. Been working steadily every day, and suddenly nothing to do, so I took a job with a contractor building garages. The development we moved into was a new development, and this guy first hired me to do some wiring of a garage, and pretty soon I was building garages, and I was a crew leader and had a couple other guys working for me, and I really enjoyed it, working outside, doing construction. Was a very enjoyable activity. This went on for some 7 or 8 months, and suddenly I got a call from the plant guy I knew back in Delaware. He said, how would you like to go to Japan? And I thought, gee, that sure would be neat. So 2 weeks later, I was back in Delaware getting some training, and I was off to Tokyo for a 2-month stint. For them, it was a good deal, because they once I got done, they could send me home. They didn't have anybody particular to send, and they wanted to try to figure out what was wrong with the Japanese operation. Instruments weren't selling, and my job was to find out why and straighten them out. Well, it was a very interesting period of time. The people I worked with were great. I learned a whole lot about Japanese approach to customers, which is quite different from the American approach, and discovered that the problems weren't in Japan, the problems were right back in Delaware. And that was what I reported when I went back there, that in fact what they needed to do was ship good product to the Japanese office, and the Japanese office would sell it, but they weren't going to sell products that didn't work, because they were very concerned about their relationships with their customer. In fact, they used the concept of honor, and I found that kind of interesting, because if there's anything that's not discussed in American boardrooms, it's honor. And to go back and talk to a bunch of American managers about concepts of honor is it's so strange that I don't know why it should be so strange, but it's a real strange concept in a country that where you have so much of let the buyer beware. And but I did. I gave a talk to the people about what I'd learned and why the Japanese were doing what they were doing, and I felt that they were acting quite correctly. Well, that particular assignment, which lasted for 2 months, grew into an activity that went on for some 8 years. I probably, during those 8 years, spent more than half the time back in Delaware. I would go for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, or so I made the trip at least once a month, sometimes twice a month. And one afternoon, I was um um, asked by a representative of DuPont Canada if I'd be interested in moving to Vancouver for 3 months or 4 months and doing some work for them there. And I said, well, that sounded like a good idea. So I got a work permit and went up to Vancouver to look for a place to stay and look the job over. And what I found when I got there was that the problems weren't in Vancouver. The problems were in Toronto, where again, where the headquarters was. It's interesting how the managers always seem to think that the problems are at the bottom of the problems are generally managerial problems, but they always want to look for somebody down at the bottom of the heap to blame their troubles on. So there really wasn't any point in going and living in Vancouver, but I started making regular trips there, so maybe every other week. I had an apartment there for a while where I could leave my stuff, and so I began a kind of a triangular flight pattern from San Diego, Vancouver to Wilmington, and then once a month or so up to Toronto. Um, I really enjoyed working in Canada. Came to really admire their healthcare system since I was working with people in the healthcare business, and they are very, very proud of their healthcare system, and it seemed to me to be kind of the answer for the United States, despite the most recent flap within the Congress about the healthcare system. But Canada was covered a 2-year period, and made some friends there that continue to be friends to the present time. The retirement years, the 8 years that I was working, did have a lot of opportunities for travel. We bought an RV and began to take some trips. We drove to Alaska, which is something I'd always wanted to do, up the Alcan Highway, up into the Yukon and across into Alaska, down into Mexico and over into Texas. In fact, we drove across Canada. So my apprehensions about what I would do in a camp, in an RV camp for 3 or 4 days, I kind of thought I'd go crazy with nothing to do, but it turned out that we usually traveled with a couple of other RVs, and never seemed to have a problem in finding something to do. And so the latter years have been a time to try to learn how not to work as much, but it's not very easy to switch over and change your way of living. So life continues to be a very fast-paced life, and there always seem to be things to do. One of the books that had a great effect on my life was a book by Jimmy and Rosalind Carter called Everything to Gain. When he lost the bid for the presidency, he had gone back to Plains and put a floor in his attic, and described in his book how how much that had done for him, take a hammer and drive nails and do some construction. And from that, he had gotten involved in a program called Habitat for Humanity. We have also gotten involved in that program. We were down in Georgia for a week. In this program, you spend, in 5 days, you build a house with a team of people, 25, 26 people on a house, with a professional construction person in charge of the house. And I think the thing that I find so appealing to it is the way the dynamics work. The 26 strangers come together, and within a few minutes they're working as a team. If industry could ever get people to work for money the way volunteers will work, they could be fantastically successful. It's interesting that in industry you spend endless hours taking classes in team building and the dynamics of group interactions, and yet here's an organization where a bunch of strangers start on Monday morning building a house, and by Friday afternoon somebody is moving into the house, and the people all depart and go their separate ways. This past year we were up in South Dakota on an Indian reservation, built 25 houses in a week, and once again it was a thrill to see the houses go up. But beside that, in Plains or in Georgia, the people that we built houses for were in a sense a bunch of individuals. In South Dakota it was a Sioux Indian reservation, and the people were all members of the tribe. The tribe had dedicated the land, and we were guests of the Sioux Indian nation. And as guests of the tribe, we were invited to their annual powwow, and we were invited to activities. So we got to experience a lot of the Native American life and customs that made it a very unique experience. I think that the Habitat program is something that speaks to my soul. One of the things that I've been doing in recent months is working a whole lot on trying to figure out who I am and what I want to do when I grow up. And there's a number of books on the soul, taking care of the soul. As I indicated, traveling for me is certainly something that I do to take care of my soul. So is driving, which is certainly a form of traveling. And one of the things that we've been able to do through this effort with working on the East Coast is drive back and forth across the country many, many times. This has given us opportunities to take different paths, see the homes of former presidents, visit the Black Hills, and see a great deal of the country. We've also been very active, very busy with grandchildren. We spend about 3 months out of the year with grandchildren. This is done from the time school is out. We generally have them come one at a time, sometimes two at a time, always without their parents, because we find that the kids are quite different when they're with us alone. And we try to make it special for them, plan events, and let them participate in kind of our lives. But we breathe a great sigh of relief when school resumes in September, just as their parents do. It's been kind of interesting, and we've had 2 4-year-olds come out, and for their first trip away from home, they flew out from Delaware to California, and Christopher announced to his mother that he was going to California with Grandpa, but he wasn't going to stay overnight. But when he got out, he discovered that he liked it so much that at the end of 2 weeks, when he was supposed to go home, he decided he really didn't want to go home. He wanted to stay. And we'd had a similar experience with Stephanie when she was 4. She came out for the first time, and it was for her first trip away from home. And so we have managed by having the summer for the grandkids. Kia from Hawaii and Tony Anthony has been coming for 8 years now. Every summer he's out for a couple weeks, and so it's given us a chance to really participate in the lives of our grandchildren, and it's gratifying to be able to maintain a close relationship to them, even though Kia lives 3,000 miles away, and the other ones live same distance on the other side of the country. So life has been constantly changing. I still enjoy my love of philosophy. My books are still nonfiction, and I continue to try to keep up with the world affairs. At the same time, like so many other people, I've gotten involved with a computer, and that's a whole new world that begins to open up. I find that reading manuals is kind of dull reading, but it's necessary reading, and so when I wake up in the morning, I read a computer manual for a chapter here and chapter there, and so I continue to learn about these interesting devices. But it certainly has changed the way we do things and the way we think. The house continues to be altered with technological devices that people keep creating, and I think that the world in a sense becomes more interesting as it moves faster and faster. The changes that are coming about in terms of countries and even within our own country continue to amaze me. Things that a few years ago we thought impossible happening. Religiously, I guess at this point I'm pretty much a Unitarian. Don't really attend the mainline church anymore. I keep dreaming of a trip across Russia on a Trans-Siberian Railroad and a trip up the coast of Norway. One of the books that fascinated me as a kid was Richard Halliburton's book on things that he wanted to do. I remember one thing that he wanted to do was swim across the Panama Canal, and when he got down there they said you weren't allowed to do that, so he christened himself the SS Richard Halliburton and dived in and swam across the canal. But I've always had a list of things that I wanted to do. As I mentioned, one of them was build a house with my own hands, another was to drive to Alaska. And so in the foreseeable future, hope to accomplish some of these types of things, and at the same time spend more time with the kids. Of course, it's kind of funny to talk about kids, 32 and 34 and 37. But I guess that for a parent, your kids are always your kids. But now the relationship continues to change, and I look forward to activities that will bring me with more free time into joint activities with some of them and get to know them in this new and changing age. So that kind of brings us up to date. Be 65 in 5 months, and maybe by that time I'll figure out what I'm going to do with the next phase of my life.
Gonna retire when you're 65.
Is that what I'm going to do?
Oh, yeah.
Well, I don't know. Maybe. I'm going to do something.
Going to do manufacturing from jam. How about that?
Yeah, Joe would like to do that.
From jam.
Well, one of the things I've done is this past year I took a course as a lead auditor's course for ISO quality management systems. And one of the things I'd like to do is get into doing audits. In fact, I'm going to do one in 2 weeks. Yeah, you go into a company that has a system and audit their system to see if it complies with the standard. And so you could do that any place in the country. Just fly there and do an audit and come home again, 2 or 3 days. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about for my next endeavor. Yeah. Well, that was an interesting experience.
How long did it get to?
I don't know.
Oh, how many minutes now?
Well, it's 50 now, but I don't know what it was before.